You know I try to pray for you. Even when we're touching, you always make a fuss. Okay, I'm pushing. Don't touch my picture. I'm trying to pace it. You kept me waiting. I try to pray for you. I try to pray for you. Try to pray for you. I try to pray for you, for you, for you. I try to pray for you, for you. I try to pray for you, for you, even when there's nothing, you always make up something. You know I try to pray for you, even when we're touching, you always make a fuss. Okay, I'm pushing. Don't test my patience. I'm trying to pace it. You kept me waiting. I try to pray for you. Okay, I'm pacing. It cannot wait 'cause you test my patience. I try to pray for you, for you, for you. I try to pray for you. Try to pray for you. I try to pray for you. I try to pray for you. For you. For you. I try to pray for you. I try to pray for you. Pray for you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar titled The Role of Live Animal Bird Markets in the U.S. and Abroad in the Spread of Zoonotic Infections. This webinar is brought to you by Wisenetics. I am Dr. Elizabeth Bobeck, and I will be your host today. The topic of our meeting is zoonotic infections and the role of live bird markets in the U.S. and the world. To discuss that with us, we are pleased to have a great expert on the subject, Dr. Joseph Giambrone, an emeritus professor from the Department of Poultry Science with a joint appointment in the Department of Pathobiology in the College of Veterinary Medicine of Auburn University. First of all, I would like to thank you for being our guest here today, Dr. Giambrone. Your presence is very special, and all the knowledge you'll share today will add a lot to everyone here, I'm very sure. Thank you again for coming. I would also like to welcome everyone and thank you for being here as well. I know you'll have questions, so during the presentation, you can write them on the chat. They'll be answered at the end. Please feel free to join in and participate with your questions. Without further ado, let's get down to business. Dr. Joseph Giambrone is an emeritus professor from the Department of Poultry Science with a joint appointment in the Department of Pathobiology. During his 42-year career as a molecular biologist, immunologist, and epidemiologist, he has made several critical advancements in understanding the ecology of viral pathogens, led efforts to improve detection and surveillance of viral diseases, and developed new and effective vaccines and vaccine strategies to protect commercially reared chickens and fend off pathogens such as avian influenza, which have spilled over into human populations. His research has had a profound impact on practices used today to reduce the incidence and severity of viral diseases of commercially reared poultry.
Thank you for that flowery introduction, and I want to say thanks for the organization for allowing me to present this work. It's near and dear to me. I started working with the influenza viruses and coronaviruses 50 years ago as a graduate student at the University of Delaware. Let me preface my talk by saying I'm going to confine my information to viral diseases that are transmitted from the live animal market that cause pandemic. But in conclusions, I will tell you that the ways to prevent viral disease transmission can also be used to prevent bacterial and protozoal infections in humans. Starting out with avian influenza, the virus continually evolves by mutation and reassortment, producing the emergence of new subtypes which may cause a significant impact on animal health and production. Some AI subtypes can be zoonotic and therefore pose a major health to humans. The first reported influenza in poultry goes back to the 19th century, where an individual from Italy described this contagious disease associated with high mortality. He described it as foul plague, and it took many, many years later to determine the fact that it was not a bacteria. In fact, it was a viral disease, and it was given the term influenza that goes back to a Latin term which means fire, because it spread so quickly. And so 1955 is really when it was given that term. But outbreaks actually were probably occurring before that, but they were not characterized. So the first outbreaks in poultry and humans occurred in Hong Kong in 1997. You remember Hong Kong flu? And the genome segments, there's H5N1s, and they share a sequence identity. So there was a number of isolations. And also there were viruses that were isolated from shell washes of duck and goose eggs, and which were confiscated from travelers coming from Vietnam in 2001. We have continual infections with influenza, and there's a high pathogenic AI caused by the H5N1 viruses, and they were reported almost simultaneously in a number of neighboring countries in Asia, and through to January 2004, with the 9th reported at that time, suggesting that the viruses had spread recently and rapidly. They had been detected widely in the region in domestic waterfowl terrestrial poultry for several years before that. So it took some time before they, in fact, were found in poultry and then humans. The last year or two, we've had incredible outbreaks of influenza, and they've occurred in poultry companies and backyard birds and free-range birds all over the world. And 85% of the infections in commercial poultry have come from the shedding of wild birds close to the farm. So the virus seems to spread from these wild birds into the farm and then into the live bird market. And those individuals that are exposed to the internal organs of the bird while they are processing it then become infected. And it's a Euro-Asian strain. This strain has been shown to be resistant to warm weather. In the past, like in humans, when you get warm weather, the virus then is not liable. But in this particular case, it has, so it must have been changing. And also in the past, waterfowl would spread the virus, but they did not get disease. But in this particular case, they're seeing large outbreaks of disease in waterfowl, seabirds, breeding colonies, and vultures that prey on the dead birds. So this makes, in fact, the virus becoming endemic and hard to eradicate. So the spread of disease has caused incredible amounts of death or culling from the virus. Approximately 40 million in Europe, 50 million in the US. Mainly US is mainly in the central parts of the US and in layers. So, about more than 40 million layers have died and about 8 million turkeys. And there are also significant outbreaks. In the last 6 months, we've seen outbreaks in Latin America and also Asia. So it's spreading rather rapidly. And researchers say probably now that the virus has gone from being exotic to endemic because it's in migratory waterfowl year-round, and it doesn't seem to go away that it has in the past. To that end, several countries are currently vaccinated against various AIV subtypes, and many others are considering it. Europe is being considered. There's about 3 vaccines which are out there, especially vaccinating outdoor birds or birds reared outside. So the virus in the bottom slides show it spreading in animals, wild animals, and commercial animals, backyard animals. And then up in the top left, you can see that it can cause pneumonia in humans and conjunctivitis. So the virus, as I had spoken before, spread by mainly waterfowl, mainly mallard ducks. And from there, it can spread to lots of other birds and other mammals. And we have seen in the past recombination from bird flu into swine and then into humans. But what we're thinking about now is that it's coming from these wild birds into the farm, where it then becomes incredible. It expands rapidly and then gets into humans. And you can see the numbers of H and N's, which viruses are characterized by the hemagglutinin and neuraminidase. Outdoor rearing of poultry, which is quite common in Southeast Asia, where the birds are not confined at all. You can see how they could mix with waterfowl and then end up in a live animal market. The first reported case of avian influenza outbreaks in humans transmitted from birds occurred there was an H5N1 occurred in Vietnam in the late 2003. However, there are other different subtypes of influenza viruses that were low pathogenic. Low pathogenic ones basically cause very little disease. And you can see that there are other viruses that were isolated from domestic waterfowl during live bird market surveillance in Vietnam in 2001 and 2003. So this is first cases of the virus coming from the live bird markets. It's interesting that the 1918 virus that causes the epidemic that's killed millions of people around the world was triple recombinant from bird to swine to humans. And back that time, the incredible amounts of disease because there were no antibiotics, no antivirals, no way to test for it, no PPE, so that there's really no way to treat it except you can see these individuals being kept in large confinement with air. And it's quite interesting back then that they realized that you need to wear a mask, and you see on the right it says wear a mask to go to jail. We didn't quite get there with coronavirus, but certainly mandates were important because we knew at that time the spread of the virus can occur through aerosol. So there were a lot of, since that time in 2009, so we're actually going to the 21st century, bird flu cases of H5N7 and H9 caused up to 50% mortality in China and Asia. Human infections required close contact with birds, which are, again, when the live animal markets where individuals were then exposed to the tissues where the virus is. There's only been a few cases where individuals have gotten it from farms, and human-to-human transfers of AIV are rare, but that's why we've always been thinking about pandemics, because if the virus changes in some way, you could get the human-to-human transfer and end up with it. And you can see in this particular case, individuals are bringing it to the live bird market. This was in Asia, and it's both humane and there's no supply chain management. You don't know where these viruses or these birds are coming from. And sometimes these birds can be sick, but you can see then the live animal market there is outdoors where people could just come by and then be exposed to the virus. Again, in these live animal markets, you have mixed species, and then you could see how you can get a recombination from bird to swine to humans and infect humans which have no resistance to those viruses. In another case here, you can see how individuals are just processing these birds and not having any real sanitation or hygiene or protection of the individuals from getting infected. And you can see the number of different species there. You got swine, you got birds. On the left, we'll talk about civet cat. So these you can then get viruses then transmitted across species. So that's influenza, and it continues to be a problem with worldwide infections in humans and in birds, which has caused the price of eggs and chickens and turkeys to skyrocket. So now we'll get into coronaviruses and severe, what we call severe acute respiratory syndrome, or SARS, and it's a respiratory human virus caused by coronaviruses. Between November 2020 and 2003, an outbreak of SARS occurred in Hong Kong with about 8,400 cases and 923 or 10% or more, almost 11% of fatality. So the virus wasn't spreading that quickly, but the high probability of fatality. Within weeks, SARS spread from Hong Kong to individuals in 37 countries in early 2003. In 2003, the epidemic disappeared for an unknown reason, and that was good. But when you see the SARS that we have now, individuals, when it first started in 2020 around the world, people weren't really concerned about it because they thought, well, it would go away just like this first SARS, but in fact, it never did. And so there was some good and bad with this first one. And this is the civet cat, which is a weasel-like wild animal, but they also can be farmed, and they end up in the processing plant. And it's been shown that the virus starts in horseshoe bats in the wild and then spreads to these civet cats. And then these civet cats are then brought to live animal markets, where in fact, this is where the SARS-1 started out. So that one is gone, but the idea of it and how it can spread from live animal markets then was understood. And during that time, there had been a lot of vaccines being worked on, including the ones, the recombinant vaccines that they're out there now, as well as the messenger RNA. And it's good that they had been working on it for so long, so that when we had this recent outbreaks of SARS-CoV-2, we had these vaccines, which are all they needed to do would be tested for about 6 months in humans. And that's where we are with that one. So the next coronavirus that caused a pandemic is called MERS, because it occurred in the Middle East, and it was another coronavirus, and it represented one of 3 major zoonotic coronaviruses to have emerged with global impact in the past 2 decades. So again, this originated from bats into animals and then into the live animal market. And it occurred alongside with the first acute respiratory, or SARS-CoV-1, in 2002 and 2003. So actually we had 2 coronavirus diseases going on at the same time, and it caused this severe acute respiratory syndrome, which we call coronavirus 2 or SARS coronavirus 2. And it continues to occur. The good thing about this one is it seems to be located only in the Middle East. That has not spread around there. Then they hadn't had to vaccinate. So the earliest known outbreak of this MERS again came in the Middle East in Jordan in April 2012. Since that time, 2,500 cases have been determined, with 880 deaths, representing a case fatality rate of about 34%. And it's been recorded in 27 countries, but mainly confined to MERS to Middle East. How it got to these other countries was again by humans bringing it around the world. So the first detection of this virus used by serology determined it was in camels in another part of Jordan. And the camels were later confirmed as a reservoir of infection, with bats being the likely ancestral host. So just like the first coronavirus, it appears that these wild bats then, which can also end up in the live animal markets, and then go into camels in this particular case. The disease continues, but remains confined to a small area in the Middle East, with no vaccinations being used. So if you've ever been to the Middle East, or you've seen it, photos or on TV, basically individuals are bringing these camels in. Some are farmed, just some are wild, and you can see the interface between humans and the camels, and you can see rather quickly how this can then be exposed to large amounts of individuals. So this SARS-CoV-2, which is what we have going now, is the 3rd coronavirus pandemic to emerge, and is caused by a coronavirus. And it first appeared in 2019 in China, and then spread globally in 2020. The World Health Organization has shown that, and basically really when we got large outbreaks was in March of 2020. But it had really been circulating around the world prior to that. A year ago, the approximate number of world cases was 510 million, with 2.6 million deaths and economic loss of 14,000. This was a slide that's at least 6 months old, and so we've surpassed all those figures in infections, death. And if you look at what's going on in China, we're getting really close to having large amounts of individuals infected in the hospital. The latest figures I've seen were about 4 million individuals in China are sick and have ended up in the hospitals, although they've not been really giving this information forthcoming to the rest of the world. So you really don't know, when they give these numbers, you really don't know how close they are. And probably because they don't have the infrastructure for testing, they're really not sure. So this is how it starts. A lot of individuals have been infected, and it starts out in mostly younger individuals. It's just a mild cold, which goes away in 2 weeks. But individuals that are old have immune suppression, are having more severe disease. They're having chronic infections, they call long COVID, and individuals, even when they're vaccinated, especially in nursing homes, can still get infected because of their poor immune system and also die. So we know that it took at least 6 months in the US before we developed this PPE, protection device equipment, and started using the respirators to protect people. And it was shown that if you put them, lie them down on their stomachs, they have less buildup in their lungs and less likely to die. But we lost over 3 million in the US, and a lot of it had to do with too slow in the detection, too slow in the treatment, too slow in the vaccination, and the hospitals just weren't prepared to. They were overwhelmed rather rapidly. So the epidemiologists, it appeared to come from China, and the first reported cases were in the Wuhan seafood market, which is basically a large animal market. They had, or animal market, because they had more than just seafood. Followed by spread from there around the world. And so the WHO, World Health Organization, determined that animals were shipped from farms, even probably wild animals, to the central market in Wuhan, which appeared to be the epicenter of infection. There appeared to be ancestral, again, came from bats, and there appeared to be an intermediate. And in this particular case, there individuals that they're thinking about it came from this pangolin, which is an armadillo-like animal, and then getting to the market and then spreading, infecting the individuals in the live animal market, which then spread it around the world. So in this particular case, you had the virus continually on. Initially, they thought that it would go away in warm weather, but it did not. In fact, it spread more rapidly there because the individuals in warm weather came out and then were more likely to interact. So this what's going on in this large animal market is about as worst case scenario as you can get. You have the bats there. You have the person who's selling them in not wearing any kind of PPE and smoking a cigarette. And then you have the patrons coming in who are then getting exposed from the virus from these bats, or it goes into other animals. And you can see on the right-hand side there, an individual is actually bringing his child in. And the market is totally exposed, and it's not enclosed at all. You can see outside, and people just roaming in and then can easily pick it up. This is the pangolin, which they're in fact going to process. And it's quite interesting. I picked this up from the internet. You can see how these animals come from Jakarta, where they're endemic, but then they follow these paths, and they have two paths. One is through land, and the other then is through boat. And probably through here, we have an illegal trade going on where the animals are just brought in and nobody knows it. And then all of a sudden, they end up being in live animal markets, 1,000 miles away from where they came from. And you can see how they could spread the disease probably along the way. So the World Health Organization also called there's a health for humans, and then there's one for animals. And it was formerly called the OIE. For many years, the Animal Health Organization was OIE, but now it's the World Organization of Animal Health. And basically, they're around to coordinate, support, and promote the animal disease control. They are very transparent transparent, much more than countries would be, some countries anyway, through a system that individuals can get the data on the internet. So the framework can go from this World Organization of Animal Health to veterinary services around the world, which will then allow them to implement effective surveillance, reporting, and controls. This was set up mainly for influenza, and we've gotten a lot of use out of that for the last year, in which we determined the influenza virus was spreading. So this organization disseminates a really important information so that countries can know exactly where this virus is and where it come from, and it will help in determining whether the virus in humans, or we transmitted from humans through animal health, or possibly intentional introduction of pathogens. The coronaviruses will, in fact, have not. It's been determined that they were not weaponized, because they sequenced the virus, and they found out that in order to do that, you'd have to have large number of genes that were changed, or through recombination, or passing it into animals, but that had not been done. You didn't see those changes in the sequence. So this information can get out immediately to people around the world, and this will allow information that individuals can use to help prevent or control it. So I want to talk, Billy, about the live bird markets and how it is differentiated from bird markets in countries where they do not have the infrastructure to do so, or that countries where culturally they've been doing these live animal markets for 5,000 years, and those markets are then where you can get the transmission because there's not really good control. And these markets, in more advanced countries in Europe and other countries, they would then use very similar control measures that in the US, but in the smaller markets, they don't do that. So the individuals that own these live animal markets or the individuals that can go to these markets are usually immigrant populations. And one of the areas where you see the most of it is in New York, but there are live animal markets all across the Northeast and also in California, where you do have large immigrant populations. So they prefer to choose the animals from that are live, that they know that rather than something that's been frozen and sold in a grocery store. And these patrons in New York City, it's incredible. They speak many different languages, and they tend to go to the market that's speaking their language, because they're raising it, or they're processing it that they're used to in the way they're used to in their foreign countries. The patrons tend to be new or first generation immigrants, and many types of poultry are sold, including geese, ducks, quail, various broiler chickens, pigeons, guinea fowl, spent layers, and also small animals. Then mammals would also be sold in these markets. Rabbits, pigs, etc. So the way that these live animal markets are handled is that when they come in, they come from registered sources. They're not coming from backyard flocks, and at least for influenza, they've been tested prior to that. And in this case, no wild animals can enter these markets, which is extremely important. You don't have bats, civet cats, pangolins getting in there. And the animals are not currently tested for coronaviruses, but this could change in the future. And there's been a lot of talk about doing that. And there's also, as a result of the coronaviruses, the governments were considering, in fact, closing these live animal markets, but that hasn't been done, and that could cause a lot of problems to individuals that are used to going to these markets. So birds are weighed and sold to patrons by a pound, so that they have an idea, just similar to get in a grocery store. No mixing of species. The species then were separated. Birds would be separated from pigs, and pigs from rabbits, or whatever else they're selling. The housing or the facility where they're taken to is totally enclosed, and the patrons are separated from those animals. They're not allowed to, in fact, go and touch the animals. Okay, they may be able to choose them at a distance or through a window, but there's not close interface between the patrons, the individuals which are processing, and the live animals themselves. The facilities are closed, so you don't have individuals just walking in from the street that just go out there and just look at the birds. They have to go through a separate entrance to get in there. And you would have strict sanitation and hygiene, both inside and outside. Outside of these facilities are also washed down, and inside they are regularly washed down with disinfectant. And individuals that are processing them they wear protected clothing and wash their hands and such like that. No smoking or eating is allowed in any part of the facility. Even if you just walk inside, you're not allowed to smoke or eat, because obviously you could tell if you were smoking and eating, you could inhale the virus that way. And in olden days, 70 or so years ago, I can remember my grandfather going into these facilities. He came from Italy at a young age. You could actually take the live animals home, and he processed them. That is certainly not allowed now. If you're going to get the animal, it has to be processed there and then given to the individual. You're not allowed to take them home with you. So also important is that they're depopulated every 6 days, and the markets are totally disinfected. In a lot of these markets around the world, it's not done. They just keep animals in there all the time. And sometimes the animals are then, if they're not sold, they end up going back to the farms which were raised, which can then basically recycling the viruses. So if one farmer is bringing infected animals and then they're exposed to another farm and they end up bringing them home, this would be a way that you then can expose your animals that you have on the farm. To that end, no zoonotic viral disease has been originated from live animal markets in the U.S. And that certainly would then eliminate coronaviruses or influenza viruses to get into the human population and end up spreading, become epidemic or pandemic. The difference between epidemic and pandemic, epidemic would be infection of a large number of people in an enclosed area, circle an area, whereas a pandemic then could spread throughout the world. This is a map of New York, and you can see in the middle there is Manhattan, and over to the right side you have Queens and Long Island, and the color refers to the ethnic origin where the individuals are going to. So if individuals are Latino or Asian, they would go to a market where they were processed according to what the people have done for thousands of years. And you can see the incredible amounts of concentration of these large animal markets in an area where there are, in fact, millions of people living. And in this case, you can see that you basically have one age of broiler chickens. So you don't have any other ages. You don't have any exotic birds. The individuals are wearing masks, and the patrons are there, but they're not close enough to the animals. And in many places, they're not even allowed in there, in with the live animals. And so there's no touching of the animals, and you can see they're wearing masks. There's some biosecurity here, which is needed. And then the animals are, in fact, processed in a clean area. You can see that the person is wearing some PPE there, which the personal protective equipment, that is not done in a lot of foreign countries where the birds are being processed out in the open, where individuals can be exposed to those. In this particular case, you have good sanitation and hygiene, which is important then to prevent the shed of the organism, not only to the workers, but outside people. And whether this is a virus or a bacteria or a protozoa, if you follow these procedures where you've got the good sanitation and hygiene, you're not going to get, or less likely to get, exposure of these pathogens to humans. Although it's still obviously, if the animal came in with Salmonella or E. coli, there's always a possibility that individuals can be exposed, but to a lot lesser extent. And in this particular case, you can see the Spanish on the side, but you see the individuals going in there. You've got an enclosed system. It's sanitized both inside and outside. The individuals are coming out with bags. They're not just carrying them out. And it's much like a small grocery store, a corner grocery store, though it's done right there, as opposed to being sent to a central processing area where the birds are cut up and then frozen and then sent to a grocery store. In this particular case, individuals want to go to a small area where they know the birds have been processed by individuals that come from the same countries as they do and processed in the way they want them to be, whether there needs to be some sort of prayer sent to while they're being processed, or processed in a certain with certain feed that they would want, that they consider against or for their religion. So the conclusions here, and these conclusions would be then used for prevention of disease or the zoonotic infections to spread to from the live animal markets. So starting with going back to the wild birds, keeping the wild birds out of the chicken house is extremely important at that particular time. In most commercial operations, they are enclosed, but we're moving more and more to birds that have some outside content where they're enclosed there and then they come back in to eat. But in Europe, where they had a lot of that, where you call it free range, they are slowly being enclosed. They're not allowed to go out anymore because of the influenza. And and you have to reduce the interface between live birds, wild free-flying birds. And other ways they're doing this is that they're removing any water outside or spilled feed outside, which could prevent the live animals. And not only birds, but rodents, other animals have insects to get them into the house, because it's been shown before that these small animals like rodents and insects can transmit not only bacteria and protozoa, but viruses themselves. So preventing the exposure of these, what we call them vectors, wild vectors, to get into the house is extremely important. Other thing is that in the past, there was sharing of equipment from different farms. We saw that a lot in the layer industry in the Midwest. That is then frowned upon. They're trying not to do that. And in some cases, they are fences around these farms where you have to sign in and out, and you're not allowed even to bring your car on there. And so you have some knowledge of who, in fact, is getting in the houses. So if you prevent anything getting into the house other than the individual that works on the farm, if you do have some laborers in there, then they have to go through the washing, changing the coveralls, changing the boots, so that they are not bringing it in. And individuals who work on these farms are in fact, they are not allowed to have any live animals themselves. So basically, once it gets from the farm to live animal markets, there is then some supply chain management in the fact that the live animal markets then know what farms they're coming from. And in the US and other countries, in fact, they are tested for influenza virus on the farm before they, in fact, get to the live animal market. So in the live animal market, we talked about this before, you need to have sanitation and hygiene measures. And you need to use the proper disinfectants, because and you need scrubbing. We know that these disinfectants won't work if there's organic matter in there. So you wash off the organic matter first, and then there's scrubbing the surfaces to make sure that the sanitizers have to be in contact with the area that you're trying to sanitize for at least 15 minutes. So just spreading it on there with a hose and then washing it off is not going to get it done. And that's why they always say that when you wash your hands, you need to be washing them for approximately 5 minutes and scrubbing them. I know most people don't do that, but that's the best way to work. And sanitizing your hands is one way to prevent you getting flu and coronaviruses, because if you don't, you then can spread it to your nose or your mouth or whatever. And they need to also, you need to have rodent control, insect control in these facilities, because if you get these animals, these wild animals, insects into the live bird markets, then in fact they can bring in all kinds of pathogens. So, we talked about this, animals coming from licensed providers. The slides I showed you early on, that didn't happen. People were bringing them in, and I've seen it because I spent time in China. They'll bring them in bicycles, pickup trucks, bags, and you don't know where these animals are coming from. They, in fact, in some cases, they're sick. On individuals then that have the farms, they may in fact eat their own sick birds or dead birds, because that's all they have to live off of, or that's the only way they can get money, by selling them to the live animal market. So no wild animals should ever enter the live bird market, and we saw that in Asia. And again, this is a cultural practice that has gone on for thousands of years, and it's hard to stop that. I know China and some of these countries will close down these live bird markets, but within 6 months they reopen again. And it's hard when you have that many markets within a city. It's really hard to control that. You should never mix animal species. We saw early on in my slides where you had a mixture of all kinds of animals, mammals, and birds. If they're going in a live bird market in the US and other places, if you're going to have these sold in that market, in one live animal market, they need to be separated. Different cages, different facilities, different people working on them, so that there's no transmission of these organisms from one species to another, because we talked about pigs being the great mixing animals, where the virus spreads from the bird into a pig and then into humans. The facility must be shut down once per week and cleaned out and depopulated. Birds, it's a one way. Birds should not go to the live animal market and then be sent back. And that would be, you wouldn't allow to do that. And if you get any sick animals inside the facility, then all the animals within that facility are depopulated, and the facility then is sanitized. I know if you get influenza and some of these others, they have a downtime. There are downtimes on the farms. Downtimes on the farms for influenza can be up to several months, up to 2 to 3 months, to make sure that the virus is not continuing on that farm. you need to have patrons separated from live animal processing facility. And I know in some places they have not done that, but that needs to be done because these viruses can spread if you're close enough. And wearing a mask or gloves or something would certainly help. And patrons should not leave live animal markets with live animals. And I know in the past, I said before, I saw my grandfather and other people were doing that. They were in fact buying the animals. In fact, I can remember when I was young, you could go by these facilities and see the animals that you want in the window. And then you'd go in there and say, I want to buy these animals and take it home. And I saw that a lot in China when I was doing sabbatical there about 15 years ago. People then were going in there and bringing live animals home and processing them themselves. And also even in restaurants where I went to, sometimes the birds were out in cages and other animals too, outside the restaurant. So you can actually point to the ones, they had snakes, frogs, all kinds of animals there. You pick the ones you want and then they take them back and process them in the restaurant. So that's about a worst case scenario as you can have. So that pretty much wraps up what I wanted to present. I guess I'm in the 40 minutes that I needed to have, and I hope you enjoyed it and gained some information, especially the conclusions. If you don't follow those conclusions, more than likely we're going to see individuals getting sick and possibly epidemics and pandemics, which we won't want to see, because around the corner there's always going to be a new virus, and we've seen that before, which can get out, and the individuals that are not, we're totally susceptible because we don't have any immunity to it. So that being said, my webinar has concluded. So if there are any questions, I'll take them.
Thank you again. That was really, really interesting. And we do have some really good, interesting questions from the group. So the first question that kind of is a segue from your conclusion is, what are the main challenges in implementing effective measures to control the zoonotic infections from the live animal bird markets?
Well, first off, you need to have government control of these. They have to be tested. I know in the US, we have APHIS, which actually sends individuals out there to make sure the protocols. I mean, every farm in the US and many other countries, they have SOPs, or standing operating procedures, in both the farm and the live animal market, and they're given information there as how they should process these birds, the things that I talked about. And I've seen these agendas and to SOPs, but sometimes they're not enforced. And I even saw that in farms in the US, where the information is right on the wall there, and you walk in the door in both English and Spanish, but yet there's still individuals then that there's no way then to, it's extremely hard to enforce those. I don't know if that answered the question, but other than the conclusions I gave with sanitation, hygiene, and all the others.
So as far as the US goes, would you say that our efforts have been effective following the measures you outlined?
Well, it was until we saw these viruses, influenza viruses, that are year-round, and they've come in other species that we haven't seen before. But it's interesting that these disease was confined to the layer industry in the Midwest mainly, but it luckily didn't occur into the broiler areas, which are mainly in the Southeast. And I'm not sure exactly why that is, except that on these egg farms, you can have up to 3 or 4 million, where on most broiler farms, you have no more than 500,000. So maybe it's just easier to control the disease in the broiler belt and the broiler farms, and much harder in the layer farms. But we need to step it up. Obviously, more than 40 million layers have died from or culled in the last year and a half, and about 8 million turkeys. So we know what we need to do, and there's been a lot of controversy of whether we're vaccinated or not. And vaccination is a problem because so much of the U.S. Birds are sent out and exported, and countries that they may embargo, and they will embargo U.S. and other countries around the world that are vaccinating, because the vaccine will prevent clinical disease but not shedding of the organism. So we need to do a much better job, obviously. And now we're in a new year, and we'll see. That these viruses start in Alaska and Canada, where the breeding ground, and then they follow that pattern down through the U.S. and now into Latin America. And it's hard to control them, but we do have a lot of testing in those breeding areas. The Wildlife Association in the U.S. now, I think, is testing more than, I think, 50,000 wild birds a year for influenza. And but again, you can still have outbreaks.
So if you have your crystal ball, do you think that we're going to have a period of time without avian influenza, or do you think it will be fall and spring every year, just kind of like it was the last year and a half?
I would, right now, everyone is concerned. I mean, there are meetings, scientific meetings around the world, industry meetings. They're concerned that the virus is now endemic in wildlife. If it's endemic in wildlife, it's going to, in fact, find its way into the poultry community. So I don't think we're going to see times in the summer where we can get a respite from this virus. I think that we're going to have it for who knows how long, and that's why we need to do a better job of biosecurity. And I think that's why eventually we may have to go to vaccinations. And what they're trying to do right now is to tell countries around the world not to embargo. And one thing we have done through the World Animal Health is that we are compartmentalizing the area that has the virus, meaning that if you can show that it's regional, let's say just in the Midwest, then the poultry from the Southeast and other areas should be able to be sold. And they call that compartmentalizing. I think what we may see is ring vaccination to slow down the spread of the virus. I really don't think that we're going to see it end. And a lot of animal welfare people, they want us to vaccinate because they see these birds suffering because we are basically using whole house shutdown to kill birds. And up to 1 million birds in a house can be they heat up the house and then close off the air, and then basically the birds suffocate. But it's felt that that is a more humane method than allowing them to die over days or weeks.
So do you think there could be strategies I think you did. Are there
wonderful
strategies that we can use in the wild bird population to vaccinate if we're not allowed to vaccinate in the commercial population? I know other species like rabies vaccine has been used in wild animals to reduce.
Right. The problem with these flocks, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of birds, and actually millions that are in the breeding area in Alaska and Canada. And it's the virus which are there now came from wild birds that came from Europe and Asia and then recombined to infect the birds in the northeastern part of the world. And we've already started seeing outbreaks in Canada. So this in 2023. So it's only a matter of time. Those birds then are going to migrate to southern areas as it warms up. So I'm not really sure. More testing, more surveillance in these wild animal flocks, wild bird flocks, and more testing on the farms or be about the only way we can do it. I mean, there's really no way to vaccinate large flocks of chickens. I mean, wild birds. It's just really impossible. You'd have to fly over them in helicopters and planes. But I don't see that happening.
Yeah, the flying over them in helicopters would also cause them to move, I'm sure. So
Yeah,
it becomes a
exactly.
little more challenging.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, they do
Um,
the cannon netting to test them, but
mhm.
and as those birds are tested, they could be vaccinated, but that's only a small number of birds that in the U.S. I think they're approaching 50,000 compared to the millions that you're flying. I mean, we know that they have these birds come down in flyways. There's 4 flyways in Canada and the U.S. And so if you could confine it to one flyway, then you'd know it's coming to you, and you could be doing a better job of surveillance. We have quarantine if a
Yeah, that's a
flock.
really thought.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there are. I mean, if the virus shows it up in a certain area, there's quarantine. I think 10 miles. Everything within that area that has the virus cannot move out of there, and so they have to test everything in that area, and only those which are negative would be able to move out of there. And that also includes eggs and poultry and litter and feed and everything else. So some quarantine helps. I mean, there have been outbreaks in the southeast in areas where the broiler, especially, there have been outbreaks in wild birds in the southeast, but through better biosecurity and quarantine, we luckily haven't had it spread to farms. Although in the past there have been some farms and breeder farms that in the southeast and broilers which have been infected, but they do a fairly good job of quarantining and depopulation using vent house ventilation shutdown.
Is there anything else, or do you have a final message for those of us that
Uh,
are listening?
I think what I've talked about would be to have good surveillance in the live bird markets, in the farms, wild birds, preventing the interface between wild birds to the chicken house and then to the live bird markets. And everything I talked about with sanitation, hygiene, biosecurity, to prevent the organism getting out. And we've done that in the U.S. as far as zoonotic infections from live bird markets. But again, we're seeing it in other countries, in Africa and some of these other countries where you see these coronaviruses that are continually mutate. And again, because they don't have the infrastructure, they don't have the vaccines, they don't have the testing. And so those countries I think there are always going to be pockets of coronavirus and influenza virus. It's not going to go away. People ask me all the time, will the coronavirus go away? And I say, no, it's in bats, it's in wild animals, it's in humans that don't have the infrastructure to control it.
Yeah, that's really interesting and important information. Well, thank you once again for your excellent presentation. You've done a great job of gathering relevant and timely information on the role of the live animal bird markets and the spread of zoonotic infections and its impacts on the poultry industry. We're really grateful that you had the time today to share this with us. On behalf of the WiseNetics team, I'd like to thank everybody for attending the webinar and for participating. Many thanks to the people who are backstage as well, who always contribute to the dissemination of quality information and content on poultry farming. To wrap it up, I invite you to follow the Poultry Podcast Show. I am one of the hosts, and we've got several digital platforms where that podcast is shared. In our episodes, we bring cutting edge insights straight from the minds in the global poultry industry right to your ears. Thank you again. The link for the Poultry Podcast Show is available in the chat. And until next time, everybody, thank you again for your participation and have a good day.